today I will be presenting about somewhat still related to AIG framework, but another aspect of AIG. So in this presentation, I'm working with Gierl, and both of us, we are from University of Alberta, Canada. So whenever we just use formative assessments, especially formative assessments, our hope is to give a test that can be just used for providing some feedback to our students or examinees after the test is over. Not necessarily a typical high-stakes testing so that the items are really kind of like a secret that you are just hiding those items. You don't want to reveal those items. In this case, I'm talking about more like low-stakes classroom assessments or formative assessments in this case. So automated item generation, just like Andre just explained, so is a good methodology to generate many items. And in this case, we are combining the computer technology and content expertise to generate thousands of items, maybe 10,000s and even more than that, even with like one click, and you have tons of items all of a sudden. But at the end, we get tons of items, but the next question is that how can we just relate those items back to our score reporting or maybe feedback processes. So in this case, you have 10,000 items, but how can we just rationalize those items, and how can we just relate those items to a feedback or score reporting process? And again, so whenever we use CAT for formative assessments or relatively low stakes, so the rationales for distractors help students to understand the content better. Again, our purpose is not necessarily to classify people or to decide who's going to be a doctor, nurse, or something like this, more like a classroom assessment. In this case, I can give that example. And we can use those rationales to give some feedback to our students or examinees. And again, I'm personally interested in automated score reporting and this kind of system. So that's why I'm just hoping to combine the CAT, AIG, and some other aspects of this process all together to create a more detailed formative feedback for students. So in this study, so we are just hoping to expand the AIG framework to address the content development challenge of creating rationales for automatically generated items. Again, we have 10,000s of items, but how can we just explain those items, or especially the answers to students? So initially, Mark and I, we've been planning to just use some medical examples, just like Andre just presented. So then I just realized that in most of those medical questions, I cannot even pronounce half of the words, so I decided not to use those. And I just decided to use something that is more familiar to me. So in this case, it's a course in our university. So I'm just coordinating this course, EDP by 303 Educational Assessment. This is an undergrad course required for all undergrad students in our faculty. So nearly 800 students just take this class every year, and they have to just pass this test before they start their internships and other things. So these are all Faculty of Education students and undergrad students. So we have a computer-based testing center, which is called a Learning Assessment Center in our building. So every time for the midterm and final exam, students just book their exams in their Learning Assessment Center and take the exam whenever they want during the exam week. So in order to give this test either as a computer-based test or computer as adaptive test, we need large number of items. Again, we have 800 students, and since they can just take the exam whenever they want to take, so there's a kind of like a test security issue too. So we don't want them to memorize the items, go back and then tell the other students. So the other students who take the exam later in the week will get better scores than students who take the exam early on. So here's an example item, very simple item from EDP by 303. So we are just giving this rubric example as a source, and the question is, in this analytic rubric, the identification of expenses is an example of those following options. So in this case, you can just see this as a template item or just a sample item. So the right answer is a criterion. So now I will just show this, how this can be just used for AIG and for creating rationales for the following steps. So this slide is pretty similar to what Andre just presented. The question includes a problem. In this case, the problem is the analytic rubric. The source of the information comes from the rubric image that I just provided at the top of the question. And we have some key features to to create different instances of the item. So I can either ask questions about the identification of expenses, justification of expenses, or other aspects in this source. So in this case, the problem again consists of two pieces: the criterion or category. So I have two things that I can just use in this question. So it's an analytic rubric. This is my problem, and it comes from a rubric table. This is my source in this case. So I have lots of elements and constraints. In this case, these are the things that I can just use, the elements I can use in my question. But there are some certain constraints because I can either ask a category or a criterion. So again, this is a really simple example. There's only one type of question that I can really ask. So what is the any element in the rows or just the columns of that rubric table? But at the end, this is again, this is a simple item that can be expanded to a more complicated item. So we are just creating an item model in the next stage. So this is just like Andre explained, this is a cognitive item model. In this case, we have the rubric, and the item stem says, in this analytic rubric, blah, blah, is an example of, and it goes like this. So all the sections with the parentheses and bold letters, so they can be replaced with words, phrases, or other things that we can just use to generate many items. In this case, the cell content in this item can be just replaced by those 6 things that you just see on the slide. So I can ask each of those things as a separate question, which in this example, identification of expenses is an example of this, or justification of expenses is an example of this. So it goes like that. So basically, I can create 6 items out of this single sample template. And again, I have only 4 options in this case. Again, this is not a complicated item. The answers are a criterion, a category, an outcome, or a descriptor. And again, we are using this program called Igor. So it's a software to enter our item models. So once you enter the item models, you just replace the cell content with those possible options to generate many items at the end. So again, it's so easy to use, and it's a really simple software. And again, just like Andre said, it's not really magical, but it combines a complicated task into a simple step. So with one click, you can really generate thousands of items. So here's a sample example, sample item. So in this analytic rubric, identification of expenses is an example of, again, so the response options are the same. So the right answer is a criterion in this case. An alternative question, in this analytic rubric, expert is an example of, in this case, the right answer is a category. So another one, in this analytic rubric, justification of expenses is an example of a criterion, which is again the right answer. So next step, using this template to create rationales to provide students. So we can just use this template to generate some feedback and just give those feedback to students at the end of the exam. So the solutions and rationales can be added into the AIG process in the item modeling step. So basically, we are using the key features to generate some feedback for students. So basically, you will see the same process, but in a reverse way. So we will go backwards, and we will just create some feedback statements using the same elements in this item. So in this case, I have a rationale template. Rather than an item template, I have a rationale template. So it says blah, blah, which is the correct response option, is the correct option as blah, blah, the cell content in the analytic rubric is a type of a scoring constraint that I just mentioned, either a category or criterion. And the key features in this answer are the key features that I listed in the question, and the incorrect option is not plausible because it goes like this. So now let's just see this in an example. And we'll just see how those boxes will be replaced by those words, and then to generate some rationales for AIG items. So the correct option can be either a category, a criterion. The other 2 options are really distractors. They are not even relevant to the question. So the key features are expert, proficient, developing, beginning. Those are the categories. And identification of expenses and justification of expenses are criteria. And I have some rationales to embed into my template. So, and this is the stage that you need to just type the rationales in advance to be able to just embed those statements back to your rational template. So here's an example. In this analytic rubric, expert is an example of one of those categories. So student picks an outcome, but the right answer should have been a category. So in this case, for this particular student, we are just creating a statement something like this. The category is the correct response option, as expert in the analytic rubric is a type of a scoring category. So the key features in this answer are expert and other things that you can just list. The incorrect option is not plausible because there's no component called outcome in an analytic rubric. So we are just going backwards to explain what we just asked in the question. So again, if I just go backwards, the question is, the right answer is the category. The student just picked outcome. In this case, I'm just saying that the right answer is category. You picked outcome, but it should have been category because outcome is not a correct response option because it doesn't belong to an analytic rubric. Here's another example. In this analytic rubric, justification of expenses is an example of, again, the same response options. The student picks the category, but the right answer should have been a criterion. So, and my rational statement becomes, the criterion is the correct response option, as the justification of expenses in the analytic rubric is a type of a scoring criterion. The key features in this answer are, again, I can list all the things. The incorrect option is not plausible because the category refers to performance labels in the columns of the rubric rather than the rows of the rubric. So basically, every time I embed each of those words into my template and I create a rationale to explain the student why he or she should have just picked the right answer rather than the answer that was selected. So as a summary, rational generation is just like an additional component for AIG. It's not a separate process. It's an additional step in the AIG process. Instead of only generating the items, we add one more step to this process, and we create the rationales at the same time that we just create the items. This method has several benefits because item and rational generation can be done together. So when you just create 10,000 items, you create 10,000s or maybe even like more rationales for each item because the same process generates the items and the rationales together. And it's a flexible feedback method to provide different types of explanation to the students. Again, especially in the context of formative testing, students really need to know why they picked the wrong answer or just right answer. So in this case, we are providing this specific feedback to students rather than your answer was right or your answer was wrong. So this might be good enough for some students, but we really need to tell them why they shouldn't have just picked that wrong answer. So, and again, it's suitable for adaptive testing purposes too. So in our case, we are still using the adaptive testing or computer-based testing. And in both cases, I can just use this plan or rational generation to provide some specific feedback to our students, because at the end of the day or once the exam period is over, we are providing some detailed score reports to our students, and I can include this as an additional information in those score reports. And again, so this example was a really simple example. I only had one thing to replace in the item, and Andre just showed us more complex examples, especially in the context of health sciences and medical examinations. So we can definitely expand this example to a more complex example by replacing many components of the item and then create more complicated items at the end. The source could be just replaced, or several components of the item stem could be replaced, or even distractors could be replaced with multiple options. So in this case, your rational generation will be more complex than this one, but again, the same framework still applies to this process. So this is end of my presentation, right? Thank you. Any questions about the rational generation? Nothing? Mark?
Do you have any feedback from the recipients of these results to go over and any kind of evaluation on what they're giving?
We are starting to use this system starting in this fall, actually, with real students and real exams. So either they will hate me, so you won't see me again here, or they will really like it. So then I will explain even more. But yes, I don't have any feedback right now related to like how they will just see this process, yes. But we will start using this starting this fall. Yes?
I was thinking about applying this in the adaptive testing context.
Mm-hmm.
So I was trying to think of what do you report then? For each student, a different list of all the items which gives all the different items of feedback.
You can either just create a combined feedback as a later process. You can even just process this information to create maybe like a sub-score level information too. So it doesn't have to be an item level information. But in my case, I'm more interested in item by item feedback. In the computerized adaptive testing, you are right. So you wouldn't just provide, let's say, 90 items and each of them lists all the feedback. Maybe it's going to be like pages of feedback for students to read. So it wouldn't make sense in this case. But in our case, the exams are shorter. They are not that long. And we are still just hoping to just put this as a kind of like a web-based reporting system, so they won't be getting any papers or anything. They can still just go back and then just read it online whenever they want to read it. But my plan is to still give it to an item level feedback rather than a sub-score or content level feedback. But it could be used as a content level feedback too.
Then there's the disadvantage to have an adaptive test. Or not?
Yes, and again, I wouldn't just use it for high-stakes testing because you don't want to release your items to your students or just examinees because then the item will be gone. So you cannot use that item anymore. In our case, our exams are not that high stakes. Once we just burn one item, it is gone. So we are okay with it, actually. Yeah. Yes.
I would say in response to that, perhaps, if you were to code, I'm thinking of a diagnostic, a skills diagnostics adaptive test, for example. And if you were to code them such that you could collate and deliver a summarized feedback. So if we use the fractions example, and we see that the person understands the need for a common denominator, but there's some other skill in which they consistently make an error. If that's been coded, you should then be able to use this approach to give standard feedback, I think, would be one workaround, possibly.
Yeah, it could be very useful, but we do many content controls in the algorithm.
That's true. So it becomes a really highly complex item model in this case. You need to control many content components, plus distractors, plus other things that you will just use in the item, maybe the source and other things. So it becomes a complicated problem. But again, so in my case, it's a relatively simple example. So, and I'm not really worried about students will memorize the item or just the item will be gone. I cannot use it again because we just generate more out of the same template and then use it again next year. So, and the students just are so ready to forget about those items once the exam is over. So yes.
Item by item feedback, I would find that each portion of the feedback is just based on one item.
Mm-hmm.
And it's as much work as the item for the students careless and distressed. It was more behavioral feedback based on crucial items.
Mm-hmm.
And that it gives you just the students and just item by item.
So initially,
Really quite misleading.
yeah, that's a really good comment because initially the automated score reporting system that I created was only reporting comments based on or feedback based on the content categories rather than item by item. So then I just realized that some students just still come back to you and then just they ask follow-up questions. Yes, I just missed this stage, but why did I just miss this? So I just want to look at my items or exam again. They come back and then bug you for the rest of the week, and then they just want to know more about the items and other stuff. And again, we are not concerned about releasing the items to students. Whoever just comes to our office, we just show the items and then we just go one by one. But yes, it's much better at the content level than you just do it at the item level. And in this case, what we do is that we always relate the exams to each other. So once the exam is over, it's not like, okay, I'm ready to forget about what I learned or what I just passed. So we ask them to just, let's say the following exam has some kind of like an overlap between the previous exam. So every time there's some kind of like an overlap, so they need to go back and then take a look at those reports. So if it's a summative assessment, that's right. So once they just pass the exam, they will just like you because the exam was easy, they passed, or they will just hate you no matter how much feedback you provided because the exam was difficult or something like that. That's right. Any other questions? Yes, Chris.
Fundamentally, test is to evaluate what you taught in the classroom. But oftentimes we find if there is a test, what's taught in class itself is changed to better prepare their students for the test. And also this AIG, if people figure out this item model, they probably will alter the way of teaching to better prepare their students to come up with a better answer and better. So I just wonder, especially under the context of this formative assessment, sometimes the formative assessment becomes part of the learning experience. Then I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing if we actually use this kind of framework when we teach them to help them to improve their problem-solving process. I just wonder, do you have any comment or experience regarding using this framework as a teaching way of teaching?
That's a really good feedback. So because right now what we do is that instead of just giving two big exams, let's say one midterm and one final, we are just trying to embed several formative assessments in between. Those formative assessments either don't count, so they just take the exam, it's voluntary, they can go sign up and then just write the exam whenever they want. So it's a learning process, like you said, they can practice what they learned. And for the summative assessments, I personally prefer to provide more like sub-score based or content-based feedback rather than item level feedback. So in this case, with your suggestion, so what we could do is that we could just use formative assessments and don't count them for any marking or grading, and then still give students really specific feedback based on the items. But once it comes to real exams, midterm and final, give them some overall feedback rather than item level feedback. So then we don't need to worry about, like they memorize the item template, they just go back and then just do it again. Any further questions? All right, thank you so much. So I think this is end of our session, right? All right, thank you.